before we get started with all the topics, maybe give the viewers and the listeners a little bit of a background of who you are and why you're excited about Bitcoin.
Sure. So my name is Jan. I am the co-founder of Swan Bitcoin and the CTO here. I also wrote the book Inventing Bitcoin, which was written in 2019. And it's a very short intro to how Bitcoin works from a technical level, but also explains, kind of the motivations of Satoshi in creating Bitcoin, as far as I understand them. My history is in startups. I came to the U.S. in 1989 as an immigrant from Ukraine. At that time, it was part of the Soviet Union, and kind of grew up here doing a bunch of startups. Swan is my seventh company now. Kind of been an early engineer, co-founder, run all kinds of things from technology, operations, risk, security, things of that nature. And I got into Bitcoin, in 2016 fully. I mean, I was definitely had some earlier touch points, 2011, 2013. But 2016 is really when I went down the rabbit hole. I actually read the white paper, even though I'd interacted with Bitcoin earlier, but it took me until 2016 to actually dive into that. Started reading everything about it and really researching the space, which included at that time researching all the blockchain and crypto garbage, which later I realized was garbage, but it definitely took me a while to get there. But really, I became excited about Bitcoin because of its monetary aspects. And when I understood that Bitcoin was a new type of money that actually had freedom aspects to it, that was really what got me excited, because I came from the Soviet Union, where we didn't have any freedom. And when we left, we didn't keep any of our money. So that was the thing for me that really was the light bulb moment with Bitcoin, and why I thought it was so important to work on it.
Interesting. I love, like, I hear that sometimes with Bitcoiners that have the background of not having a lot of freedom, and then freedom technology is a lot easier to understand when you first come into Bitcoin. I want to touch on the book Inventing Bitcoin, and I think it's like 6 years, 5 years, something like that ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there something that you like look back at the book now that you like would like to add to the book, and something like I have learned that over the last like 5-6 years that like would be really important to add to the book?
Well, obviously, a lot has happened in the Bitcoin space since I wrote it in 2019. I think at that time the market cap was something like $100 billion, and I thought that was already a huge achievement, and was sort of talking about it, in that way. But today, of course, it's 10x that, which is pretty insane to think about. Also, I think I didn't cover enough in the book on energy. I think the energy aspects of mining, which became in the later years a huge talking point in the mainstream media. You had all this energy FUD, Bitcoin's going to melt the planet, all that stuff. I don't think is addressed well in the book, and that's something I would definitely love to go back and add. And I had plans to do it, but I just been so busy with Swan and life and kids and things that I haven't really gotten to it. But I do want to do a whole section on energy usage and why actually Bitcoin is beneficial for the planet, and things like that, which are now becoming more and more mainstream narrative, but was, of course, I think the pivotal moment in 2023, 2024, when that started shifting.
Yeah, it's interesting because like when the book came out, 2019, 2020, it was not a talking point at all.
Right.
Like I remember coming into Bitcoin in 2020, and there was like no energy thing like whatsoever. It came, I think the first time really, it was like 2021 maybe, when Elon Musk kind of bought Bitcoin, and then like 3 weeks later, oh, it uses energy.
Yeah, the Elon pump and dump. I neglected to mention it uses a lot of energy. Oops, now I have to sell all of it. And then he actually didn't sell anything because, of course, Tesla and SpaceX still hold a bunch of Bitcoin. And it was all, it's Elon, right? He does random things. He's a random person. I think there's a lot of positives about him, but he is pretty impulsive. So there was some pretty impulsive stuff he did with Bitcoin. And I do think that set off, maybe that was the thing that set up the narrative chain. I'm not sure. But then there was the New York Times story. I think that was probably the biggest. That was probably the peak of the energy FUD. I think that happened in 23, I want to say, when it was the front page of the New York Times of how terrible Bitcoin is. And that article was full of inaccuracies, full of falsehoods, omissions. It was really bad. And the whole industry, I think, at that point coalesced around fighting that. And there's so many things that we put out around that I think started to turn the tide for the general narrative and, in the space of like, hey, let's actually recognize what's going on here. This is not, this is nothing new. The New York Times used to love to write about demand response and how that's great you need things to balance loads and in power plants. And then as soon as it was Bitcoin that was doing that work, it was like, oh no, now all of a sudden it's bad. So complete nonsense. And I'm glad that things are turning around now.
Wasn't it also Ripple? And I think
Right.
at Ripple it was that was funding a lot
Right.
of the campaign.
Right, because it wasn't Ripple specifically. It was Chris Larson, who was the founder of Ripple. So it wasn't like Ripple, the corporation, doing it. But he gave $5 million to Greenpeace, which then ran this like change the code campaign. I think that was called change the code. I don't remember what it was. Where they were essentially saying we want Bitcoin to change to proof of stake system because it's so bad for the environment. And I remember I spent actually a lot of time on Twitter just like making fun of them the whole time, because I was like, look, you want to change the code, go for it. Like, have fun, right? Actually, you don't even have to do any work because somebody already created a fork of Bitcoin. It's called Bitcoin POS. It's a proof of stake Bitcoin. The code is right there. There's no change. There's nothing required. Just go ahead and get people to run that code and we'll be fine. And they just didn't understand the even the conceptual futility of trying to like run a campaign to change the code. That's not a thing. That's called a hard fork, right? And then when you do that, you just create an altcoin. We've seen that happen over and over in Bitcoin, and it's not ended well for the people trying to make those altcoins. So those $5 million ultimately went to waste, or perhaps partially they were responsible for the creation of some really awesome art, like the Skull of Satoshi, which was created by Greenpeace as some sort of like attack on Bitcoin, but ultimately became celebrated by Bitcoiners and then was donated. I think it was donated to the Bitcoin magazine, right, by Chris Larson, trying to like make peace. So I don't know.
I literally saw it this year in Las Vegas at Bitcoin 2025 in person for the first time ever. So it's still the meme is still around.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's interesting because they don't get that there's no longer any politics. Like I think the angle was like, yeah, let's strong arm. The angle usually is with those campaigns, like strong arm the CEO, strong arm someone to do actually something. But there's no one you can strong arm into changing the code. You kind of have to make a compelling case of like, yeah, that's why it's actually better to change the code. And if your case is good enough, like maybe some people actually adopt the code and actually do those. But just like making a negative campaign on Bitcoin, I don't know. This was kind of like a missing mission from the start.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm not like a cynical person. I honestly think Chris Larson thought that this was a thing that he could do. Like I honestly think he didn't understand how Bitcoin worked, and he was like, maybe if I just donate $5 million and make this campaign, maybe we can like change Bitcoin. And that's not how Bitcoin works. And there's so much history to that point too, right? Because in 2017 we had the fork wars where people were trying to do the same thing. They were trying to change Bitcoin, right? But they didn't change Bitcoin. They just created a new coin. And even though at that point the consensus to do that change seemed to be very high, right? There was the New York Agreement, which was a bunch of miners and companies in the space, and it was something like 90% of the hash rate and like 80+% of the economic actors in the space came together in one room and we're like, we're going to change Bitcoin, we're going to change the block size, and they couldn't do it. And so if you couldn't get that consensus when you had so many of the sort of what you would think are the decision makers in Bitcoin all agreeing on something and they couldn't do it, that should be probably the end of the conversation. But I guess some people did not read history and are still trying to do it. So
It's also funny when you think about Bitcoin now being a 2.3 or $2.2 trillion asset, and he thought with $5 million he can change the code.
Right.
It's kind of
Right.
hilarious. How is actually I want to get that, because like how has coming up in the Soviet Union kind of influenced your view on Bitcoin? Because I think like the unique life impacts of people have a view on like how they came to Bitcoin. Because I still think even though we are getting bigger, the Bitcoiners today are pretty unique people and pretty out of the ordinary usually.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I came to the U.S. when I was a kid, right? I was about 7 or 8 years old. So a lot of what I know about the Soviet Union isn't really from memory. It's much more from my parents' stories. As a kid in the Soviet Union, I grew up like any other kid. I was running around on the playground, whatever, playing with knives, the things kids do in the Soviet Union. What I did learn after I got into Bitcoin, actually, I knew the stories about shortages, right? I remember actually standing in various lines with my parents, right? There was red lines. were essentially a completely planned economy in the Soviet Union. So you didn't have proper supply and demand signals in the market, which led to shortages, which is actually something that, that I later read, the Bitcoin Standard by Safe, and Safe talks a lot about that, how money is a transmitter of information, right? And this is a concept for me that was kind of new because I don't have an economics background. I have a technology background. So thinking about money as a transmission mechanism for what the market wants is an interesting way of thinking about it, right? In the Soviet Union, that transmission mechanism was completely severed because it was just the government that would say, okay, we have a 5-year plan. We need to produce this many potatoes and, this much bread. And if you're an engineer, you would actually be told to go and like work on the farm for some period of time to like contribute to society, right? So they were literally planning people's, and my dad had to do that. My dad was a civil engineer and he had to go and like work on a farm, right? Just it's total nonsense. So in the Soviet Union, because that was all planned, there were shortages. So number one, we did not have a mechanism for transmitting information in the economy that was, accurate. And the money was essentially like play money because it was actually the Soviet ruble had a fake exchange rate inside the country that was divorced from its international exchange rate, right? So people were paid fixed salary. So a certain job, it had a certain salary. It wasn't like a market salary. It was like if you're an engineer, you get paid 500 rubles, and if you're a teacher, you get paid 300 rubles or whatever, right? So people had these fixed salaries, and then the ruble was usable, but okay, but you can only buy whatever's being sold that day. So if there was no bread, you would buy the other thing and you would trade it with somebody else. So first of all, the economy, the nature of the money was broken. And I think that's one thing that's interesting about Bitcoin, where Bitcoin is an incorruptible transmission mechanism for monetary information, because you can have a range of let's call it useful transmission mechanisms, right? So on the very low end is something like the Soviet economy, where the ruble isn't the real money because it has no real market value. So it doesn't really, fluctuate. It just has a fixed rate set by the government and everything's planned. So there, the transmission mechanism is completely broken. Then you can have a capitalist economy, like let's say the United States, where we have ostensibly a more or less free market economy. There's supply and demand, and there are of course certain regulations and certain price controls and certain things that make it not a true free market, but it's closer. It's a lot closer to a free market than the Soviet Union. And the dollar is close to a good transmission mechanism, except for it also fluctuates, right? Because we print more of it. So it's like it's a kind of like this elastic band, right? It sort of works, but if it loses tension or it has too much tension, it could be a problem. And then on the very, very sort of the perfection end is Bitcoin, right? It's a perfect monetary transmission mechanism. It's not subject to any supply and demand changes in the money itself, so it can perfectly transmit supply and demand information. So if something is worth X amount of Bitcoin, like that's what people are willing to pay for. There's no other thing. It doesn't matter because the Bitcoin supply is not being manipulated. So I think that's one aspect that makes Bitcoin very interesting when you come from an economy that's got a broken money, is that it is a perfect type of money that transmits information perfectly. The other aspect that's interesting is when we left, and again, this is something that I found out after I talked to my parents, after I discovered Bitcoin. So it was, I was in my mid 30s, age wise. And so like, that's quite a long time to go without understanding what happened with your money when you left the Soviet Union. So I came to my parents and I said, what happened? Because I've been hearing stories that Bitcoin could be this sort of freedom money where it's portable across borders. And I'm now hearing, this is in, I guess, 2017-ish, when I was researching, or 2016. I'm hearing that there's all these problems going on in Cyprus and Iraq and Iran and like all these countries that are having hyperinflation issues and runs on banks and capital controls. So I started talking to my parents about the Soviet Union and what happened there. And they told me that we left the country, the government exchanged $100 per person at like their fixed government exchange rate. And that's all we were able to keep. Otherwise, we would have to use the market exchange rate for our rubles, which is, they're not worth anything. So they essentially gave us $100 per person. We had a four-person family. So we left the Soviet Union with $400 and a few suitcases. And that's when the light bulb was for me, like, oh, like this is what Bitcoin was made for, right? If you have Bitcoin, then you have a seed phrase and you put it in your head and you leave the country and you have all of your wealth, right? Whatever little you have of it, but something. And so we, because there was capital controls and the government just decides, okay, you can only leave with $400. Imagine how difficult it is to leave a country where you're going to have to start from zero. It's just very few people did it for that reason, right? So I think that's a game changer. And for me, was really the light bulb moment of why we should get it to Bitcoin, because this changes everything. It changes like people's ability to leave bad regimes, and that ultimately puts the pressure on the regime to be better, and then creates a much more fair interaction between citizens and the government, and not this sort of like totalitarian, you can't leave because we'll take all your money.
It's interesting when you think about the capital controls, and yeah, there's China, there's like North Korea, there's like they're pretty controlled states still. But when you look in the West, I think with Bitcoin, and I'm curious what you think about that. Now that Bitcoin is out in the open, and Bitcoin is something that you cannot put back, like you cannot just like revert the what already happened, will be harder and harder for governments to actually put in place capital control, because you just simply cannot do it anymore. There's like so many possibilities to just take your money, put it in Bitcoin, and just leave. Like
Absolutely,
the
yeah.
sheeps get wings. So I don't know. Do you think there's a possibility that we have, like there is of course like North Korea and many other places in the world where there's capital controls in many ways and forms, but do you think this from here on, because of Bitcoin, the freedom and the capital control, or the inverse of capital control, kind of only grows from here?
I think so. I mean, it's like you can look at China as an example, right? China has had numerous quote unquote bans on Bitcoin. They tried to shut down mining or shut down exchanges or whatever. They also have the great firewall, but we know that everybody pokes holes in that firewall because there's VPNs and things like that. And Bitcoin makes that really easy, right? And we know that there's tons of capital flowing out of China through Bitcoin. Russia, same thing. Like all these places that try to control flows are having a really hard time. And ultimately, because Bitcoin can be exchanged peer to peer on the street, over the internet. I mean, not even on the street. It could be done over the internet, right? You can literally message somebody over a secure channel and just transmit Bitcoin. Who's going to be able to stop that? It's very difficult. So I do think that creates a totally different situation, and we've seen it where if you have a country that's going through a hyperinflationary episode, that Bitcoin purchasing in that country goes up, Bitcoin purchasing in its neighbors goes up. We've seen this in South America, like when Venezuela was having hyperinflation, that every country in South America was buying Bitcoin. So it's definitely it's definitely an escape valve now, right? Now the question is how many people are actually using it. Is it widespread enough? I think it's very, very early still. So it's not like it's. I think at the very high end, that's probably true. Like some billionaire in China trying to get capital out of the country has probably figured out how to use Bitcoin. I don't think the everyday person necessarily is doing that. Maybe they are, but I think the flows are still pretty low, just based on how we see, even if you look at like blockchain analytics and how many people have, a substantial amount of Bitcoin in a wallet, it's not that large. So I think it's early days, but I do think it's a very strong lever that people can press, and the more that people get educated on that, and of course, to leave a country is not easy. It's not just about money, obviously. Like you have to upend your whole life. You have to take your whole family with you potentially. There's all sorts of other factors, and in certain cases, there's like people with guns preventing you from leaving. So you can't even leave if it's not even just a money thing, right? Although arguably, if you have enough of the money, you can probably bribe your way out, which is usually how these corrupt regimes work. So it's not like I don't want to pretend like it solves every problem in the world. It's not fair to say that, but I do think directionally it creates that pressure, and it creates pressure on governments. It strips them of their sort of, you have a brain drain type of thing happening where the smartest people who are the most capable and understand and recognize this early can actually get their capital out of the country, can manage to find their way out of the country. They're depriving the country of its, most valuable resource, which is its people. So that's to me why Bitcoin is so awesome and so powerful, because it actually creates that pressure, and we're going to see that play out over time for sure.
So it's basically where if you're not being attractive for those brains and for those capital to come into your country, you will ultimately lose on talent. You will ultimately lose on brain power, and therefore you also will lose on capital, and therefore
Yep.
the other country goes to shit.
Right, because like it's not enough to have oil now, right? I mean, oil is just like one ingredient. I mean, the majority of wealth in the world is created by this up here, our brain, right? Right now, like SpaceX, it's building rockets. It's like the major resource is brains, right? So you have to have that, and you have to be able to attract capital too. And both of those things are possible when you have a jurisdiction that's friendly toward, is freedom oriented, is property rights oriented, is allowing people to develop ideas in a free market type of way. And if you have a jurisdiction that's like, you can't leave, we'll take all your money, you can't, then you have North Korea, right? And what have they produced? So it's very, it's pretty black and white on that front. But a lot of countries are going to learn this the hard way, and in states too, right? You're seeing this now where people are sort of drawing the line, like, yes, we embrace Bitcoin. The United States has embraced Bitcoin, at least, they've made some motions in that direction, and some other countries are saying, no, we're going to ban this. We don't want this here, and they're basically just shooting themselves in the foot. Where they're saying, we don't want freedom, we don't want innovation, we don't want capital. Okay, fine. We'll see you in 25 years and see how you're doing.
Yeah, I hope this doesn't happen with Europe. But
right. I'm sorry, but Europe is not headed in a great direction, so I don't know.
I unfortunately agree. Yeah, and I hope like there's either there's this decisions where you either double down on your socialist agenda and you kind of try to control everything in Europe, and you can kind of try to do those, but it just makes the problems worse because the good people will just leave, and more of the good people leave, the more you double down on those things, or you make a whole reverse. And I see a little bit of like a good signal because the European Union is doing a lot of the things that we see as bad, and the European Union actually gets a lot of criticisms out of the countries. For example, in Austria, the country that is, or no, the political party that is the most critical against the European Union is the strongest one. So I see some positive things in there, but I don't know. I just hope that they're not doing anything too bad in a couple of years, because it can be bad.
I mean, I think, people will talk, people talk is cheap, right? Once you see the effects of your policies, then it's like they're going to have to reverse, right? At the end of the day, you can only push policy so far until things start to crumble. Then people, at the end of the day, it's like, if it's really, really bad, then there's a revolution. And hopefully, we don't get to that point. But people get upset when their society isn't working, and then you have all kinds of problems. So I do think that's the other pressure, is that the government can talk, but then they just get voted out of office, or at the end of the day, like, a revolution happens, and that's really bad. But that's how things change.
Thank you for watching this video. This was only a snippet of the podcast, and if you want to watch the full episode and get all of the context of this episode, you can click right here, or here. Oh, maybe also here.